Okay, Marcia Diaz currently serves as department chairperson of the School of Justice at Miami-Dade College. In 2013, she attained a Bachelor of Arts in Justice Studies from Rhode Island College, followed by a Master of Science in Criminal Justice from Florida International University in 2014. Recently, she successfully defended her dissertation entitled Exploration of Multiple Perpetrator Victimization Among Stalking and Bullying Victims, and will soon be graduating with a PhD in International Crime and Justice. Marcia has presented her research at the American Society of Criminology Annual Conference, and her work has been published in the Journal of Victims and Offenders and the Encyclopedia of Domestic Violence. In addition to her academic work in criminal justice, Marcia has extensive experience in higher education, including teaching, course development, student advising, and enrollment management. Thank you so much, Marcia. Thank you for joining me today to have this very exciting discussion.
Thank you for having me, Tegan. I'm very excited to be here and discussing, multiple perpetrator stalkers.
I am so excited. Your articles are the first time I have ever even seen anything actually addressing this phenomenon. I've heard about it. I've seen lots of people discussing it. I've heard about these things happening, but it's the first time I've ever seen an academic journal. So I was so excited. I was so excited to talk to you about this. Thank you for doing this work and even acknowledging that this issue exists. And I suppose to get into it, what exactly is by proxy or multiple perpetrator stalking, other than perhaps what it sounds, that there's more than one person? Can you explain a bit what that is?
Or so at its root, it's just that it's in multiple perpetrator stalking can take shape in many different ways. So proxy stalking is one of the many ways, and that's when one primary stalker enlists others to aid in the stalking campaign, being tracking the victim, keeping tabs on them, or helping them maybe access personal information and things of that nature. Now, it can also refer to situations where one individual is being targeted by multiple people, perhaps for different reasons. Perhaps the motivation is the same or was born out of the same situation, but they're working independently of each other. According to data so far, about 30% of all stalking victims have more than one perpetrator or report being stalked by more than one person. Now, where it gets hard to really divide the situations is because most of the stalking data out there is either very small samples of interviews or more legal data, based on arrests, protection orders, and things of that nature. But when we get into large volume data, it's surveys. And those are very much limited in the types of questions and information they have. So it's very much data points, but not a lot of story behind them. So it can be hard to really get into the motivations, for example, where somebody may recruit others to it in the stalking campaign, or perhaps how one individual becomes the victim of several people who are for different reasons targeting them. What makes that particular person more susceptible or more attractive to stalkers. But in general, as instances when one victim has been harassed to a degree where it becomes stalking by more than one individual, in my work typically has been within a 12-month period. So it doesn't necessarily refer to any time in your life, more like any time in the past 12 months has this, or have you experienced this? So that's in my personal work, those are the boundaries of the time limit of when the incidents most have occurred.
Okay, and I realize this is probably a vast question, but what are some examples? What are some examples of this behavior where it does cross into, okay, this is stalking behavior now?
Of course.
Yes, thank you.
It's been hard for me to, of course, to find it in the to find cases where this went through the courts, for example, and so where it's facts that have been documented and corroborated, and it's not typically just hearsay or the way that somebody may have perceived incidents. So in one, the two cases that I found that went through the court system were both in the state of Washington. In one case, the perpetrator had a restraining order. The victim had a restraining order against them for past behavior. So that individual enlisted friends to drive his vehicle. It was a very recognizable car. It was a red car, by the victim's home. So the victim would think it was that person that was, continuously tracking them throughout their town. And they also had their friends and family submit written reports about the victim's whereabouts, where they were following them around.
Mm.
So in that particular case, the defendant, the perpetrator was charged again for stalking for the incidents that were carried out by those third-party individuals. So it was incidents that were not carried out by the main stalker,
Mhm.
but other people. In a different case, also in the state of Washington, there was somebody who was sent to prison for violating a protection order against the victim. From prison, that individual shared the victim's personal address and other personal information and made a flyer. They don't specify really how, if that was somebody, writing out the information multiple times and sharing it, or perhaps photocopying information, but they share the victim's address and ask for explicit letters on their behalf. And so the victim at their home address was receiving a very high volume of threatening, sexually explicit letters, because these flyers promise a place to stay and money in exchange for these communications. So in that case, it was proven that the perpetrator was behind this promotion of this information and the solicitation for these letters. And so he was again convicted of stalking for those actions while already in prison for violating a protection order. And in both of those cases, it was a romantic partner that initiated
Okay.
the stalking. And so when I first started doing research in this area, proxy stalking is the only iteration, I would say, of MPS, multiple perpetrator stalking, that was addressed in the literature. And it was very much anecdotal. Of one person, this happened this way to that person who was already perhaps a domestic violence victim or may have been going through the courts. But when you get into large data sets, funny enough, romantic partners are the least likely to engage others and have multiple people targeting the victim.
I read that in your
So it
article.
seemed,
Fascinating.
yeah, and it was interesting because from the first time that it came up in the literature, it was always romantic partners.
Mhm.
And then you see that unknown strangers
Mhm.
spikes, at least in the article that I published earlier used 2006 data. I was able to, for my dissertation, use 2016 data, which significantly changes, if you think about communication, social media, accessibility to cell phones, and how much that changed from 2006 to 2016, and targeting people through those mediums. And we see that being targeted online increased the likelihood of having more than one stalker. And it seems intuitive. The more people that have access to your information, sometimes the type of information we share online
Mhm.
makes it easier for others to become interested or have access to know perhaps where we live, where we work, the places that we frequent, and makes us more susceptible to those types of incidents. But and I know this particular answer dragged on a little, but I have one more case that has
Please.
been very recent in the news, and to me, it's interested because it wasn't a romantic partner and because of the people that were involved. So this was the eBay stalking case that was in the news about 2020, 2022, and they just recently sentenced two other individuals involved. And it was about five high-ranking eBay executives targeted a couple that published an e-newsletter that had to do with e-commerce and best practices and matters that affected sellers online. And so that couple had published some unfavorable content regarding eBay, and they surprisingly, honestly, based on the how highly ranked these individuals were within the organization, but they sent the couple a preserved fetal pig, a book about coping with the death of a spouse, funeral wreath, and it was very specific messaging. And they went as far as to break into their home, their garage, to attempt to track their car. So ultimately, two of those individuals were recently sentenced to some prison time for those being involved in that. But when you think about it, if a couple came to the police station and say, hey, the CFO of eBay is harassing me along with other people, when it becomes a little bit fantastical.
Yes,
And he dwells into the realm of the group stalking that you know that you did mention in the questions.
yes.
That's more of a neurological phenomenon really than factual stalking,
Hmm.
you know, that these individuals may be going through.
Hmm.
But how would they know, you know, police?
Absolutely. And actually, Marcia, you just talked about something that just has me going with what you just said about the statistics on the domestic violence aspect. So my mind's running a little bit as you're speaking, and what is coming to mind actually, and I'll ask you your view on this. So could the group stalking situation be something less dramatic, if you will, and something as simple as you and I work together and I'm harassing you and you are filing a complaint against me, and I don't like that, so I get all of my friends together to harass you, drive you out of the workplace, and then continue to stalk you by having people text you, monitoring your social media, driving by your home, interrogating your friends, and things of that nature. Is that fair to say? Is that something that could happen? I've heard a lot about that with workplace harassment cases and whistleblower cases and things of that nature that are legitimate stalking type cases.
And that's where it becomes honestly hard,
Mm,
especially when it comes to law enforcement and what can be done for the victim.
right.
Because stalking, and speaking strictly of United States laws, obviously, and what we have on here, stalking is very subjective everywhere as to how these events affect the victim, if they cause fear, emotional distress, or where they call reasonable emotional distress, which who
Mhm.
measures that for any individual person? What's deemed reasonable? But sometimes that's when harassment crosses into stalking. And so I agree with you. It could be in certain cases that's how it begins. It's just one person and it becomes what's the word? Like a defamation campaign. It could
Yes.
be
Yes.
exclusion and just and that's in my new or my most recent work, that's one of the things that I'm exploring, if whether more relationally aggressive tactics
Mhm.
attract others or make it easier for others to get involved. Because for example, if you propose to me to break into somebody's home and do X, Y, or Z, to
Yes.
me that's a harder no, thank you. I would not like to
Yes.
be involved. And if you told me, hey, can you message this person online,
Yes.
it seems very low stakes. In anything that we do online, this term online, this inhibition effect,
Mhm.
where our actions become really separate from reality, in
Mhm.
that there's no internet police
Mhm.
who will come and find you. And we know that depending on what you do and the extent of that, you know, how that hurts somebody, there's very specific jurisdiction. But for the everyday online user who may not be, you know, in the dark web or anything nefarious like that, simply messaging somebody online or commenting on their statuses may not seem as dangerous or as hurtful.
Mhm. Yeah, and what is going
And so
on? Absolutely. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Please go ahead.
no, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. It just and what we as the target may know is stalking behavior may not be apparent to law enforcement. As you were saying, it may look totally innocuous and you may come across as very paranoid, unfortunately. So I'm just so glad that you talk about this. I'm so glad we can bring this forward, Marcia. And just kind of
Mhm.
a question, is there typically with these, in your experience, in your opinion, with these situations, a main perpetrator who may have some type of personality disorder, such as antisocial or narcissistic? Have you found any relationship there? Is there usually a main perpetrator with an issue like that going on here?
So far, based on the data that I have worked with, I have not found any connections along those lines so far. But to be honest, I have not been able to explore those avenues. Um, and something that I think it could, and I guess I'll get a little bit ahead of myself. But based on my
Sure.
recent work with the 2016 data, I was examining if having more than one stalker increase the stalking duration, number of incidents experienced by victims, and the level of distress. Now, I was specifically looking at more than one stalker, not necessarily whether those people were working together or independently. So that's something that I hope to do in the future. But something that emerged was that having a single dedicated stalker increased the number of incidents, the level of distress experienced by victims, and the duration of the stalking, telling me that perhaps somebody who's more highly motivated and may have a more personal reason for targeting that victim could be more committed. So that could be where a pathology comes in. And perhaps when you have somebody who's very committed, who's willing to ask others to help them in that campaign, that those, could be where there's some sort of I would say maybe some people with certain mental, disorders may be more willing to engage in those.
Mhm.
Whereas you also have the more, I don't want to say casual stalker online who is just engaging in toxic behavior. We have people that perhaps have way too much time on their hands and they are online, they're reading the comments, they're engaging, the internet trolls, for
Yes,
example, or the
right.
people that are doxing others online and just sharing somebody's personal information that gets picked up, or sent to their employers or
Yeah.
things of that nature. So I think the future of this work is disentangling that. What are those more, I would say, low level simple toxic behaviors that are not necessarily the more the stalking that leads to murder, for example,
Right.
or the stalking that's really really damaging to a person's life, because there's a line between annoyance and just not being able to be free of this harassment versus this person is following me and attempting to break into my home and now they have other people working with them. Although everybody's discomfort is valid, and what these situations make us feel is valid regardless of how dangerous to your life they may or may not be. But there's a line in being able to give information that can protect those people who are more likely to become susceptible to murder or like physical attacks, for example. And education is the key. Recently, there was a pilot program in New York that offered stalking education to the police departments, the state attorney's office, and victim service providers. And the stalking, it was specifically domestic violence stalking. The arrest went up about 125%. So it's not that these things are not happening, is that they don't know how to prosecute them and how to investigate stalking or how to empower the victims with the tools to really be able to collect enough information, to prove that these things are really happening to them. So just getting the knowledge out and getting this information out and talking about these cases on its own is important. Victims may feel like, is this really happening to me? Am I going crazy? When it's not. No, these things are possible, and people for millions of reasons, do all sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And would you say, if if you have any knowledge or on this, if it happens more in person or online, or could it be either?
Online. Hands down, from at least from the 2016 data, it was
Okay.
more likely to happen online. And although, so just a little bit of a snippet in my work, the most recent ones, I also wanted to look at MPS having more than one perpetrator amongst bullying victims. Since some of the behaviors that you see in stalking, bullying, harassment, they're very similar. It is
Yes.
mostly, the context, location, and sometimes the motivation or how far they go, that really distinguishes them. But for both bullying victims, which in my study were school age 12 to 16-year-olds, and then amongst the stalking victims, both online, was they were more likely to experience multiple perpetrator harassment. Um, but online also meant text messages, in at least in my study, phone calls. So it was stalking or harassment with technology, not simply, social media or through email. So it was definitely aided by technology, I would say, and exacerbated by technology.
Okay. And do you think that the technology makes it easier or more difficult in a way to prosecute? Like, would you recommend that if someone's experiencing this, that they start documenting everything? Is it kind of catch-22 in that, like you said, there's trolls all over the internet. So I mean, you can't go after everybody. What do you think of it? Is it easier to track or not?
I think it would depends on sometimes on how technologically savvy the victim may be. Because some people are just unfortunately unaware of the extent of what people can do with technology. You know, when you talk of deep fake videos, for example, if I show that to my mom, she would not even in the realm of her imagination could be that that was something that somebody put together online. So I think on some cases, because of access and things of that sort, it could be easier to track. But again, people can make unlimited numbers of accounts online with fake emails, and things like that, and have access to use the internet perhaps from a work computer, you know, or from a library computer, where now your IP address could be a lot of different sources. So I think it's difficult. It would be more difficult to track. But in the case of the eBay stalkers, for example, now that it became a legal case, they gain access to their communications and everything is there. There were messages sent that we need to deal with this right now, and like, how are we going to work on this? And there was flights purchased with their business cards and things like that, where it's easy to track the movements. But I think to as in that case, it became extreme, and because it was such a high profile company, I think once the case became public knowledge, that the sources that received is not necessarily what everyday victim is going to receive, or how highly publicized the case is going to become, or you know how quickly somebody's going to pay attention to them, unfortunately. So I think online becomes more difficult, just because of the nature of the internet on its own. You know, we have the freedom to communicate with other people, ask, hire, contract, like contract anything to do things for us. um
Mhm.
and yeah, it's unfortunate that all the tools and all the great things that we can do with the internet and communication, this is what we choose to do.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. And Marcia, on that note, if the stalking were to happen, say offline, I went out of my way to get people to follow somebody to find out their new home address and send a fake repairman there, or what, does that tend to get into more dangerous territory than online stalking?
Because it shows that you're willing to bring it offline, you're willing to go there.
Right.
When you're willing to physically put yourself or send somebody into that physical space, I think it
Mhm.
shows the intent, and the seriousness of what they're willing to do. You know, comments online are just comments. Or even when you're discrediting somebody's image online, or sharing fake information, they're not going to be physically hurt. And there are cases, for example, where somebody does that, they provide to their home. There was a case where I read where somebody that would order pizza at about 1 in the morning to the victim's home and say that they were hard of hearing, to please bang on the door as hard as possible. So the victim would wake up to this banging. And now imagine if that's a person who owns a gun and felt that somebody was breaking into their home. And I think it escalates things a little bit,
Right.
because now people react in a variety of ways to things. That factor it makes it a little bit more dangerous.
Right. And now, sort of on that note, and I'm sure the people who are engaging in this behavior are probably not watching this. I mean, maybe they are, I don't know, but probably not. I'm going to assume that they're not. Um, say, for instance, you ask me to go and follow somebody I don't know. You had an old boyfriend and you're telling me a story and you're getting me to go in my vehicle and go and follow him, or you're getting me to act in ways that are maybe not a good idea. Do you have any recommendations or maybe warnings to people if they're engaged in this, or they're thinking that this is a good idea to do on behalf of a friend? Um, are they maybe not aware that it's illegal? Is there, I mean, what could happen to you if you are, if you're caught doing this for somebody?
I
What
mean,
are some
in
of the
many cases,
yeah.
unfortunately, the types of behaviors that lead to stalking are not illegal. And that's what makes it so difficult for
Mhm.
victims to be heard, or sometimes to even recognize that what's happening to them, it's an issue. It's the pattern that makes it a problem. Many times victims go to a police station and the reaction may be, oh, you got flowers. How unfortunate. How dangerous is that? There are people with real crimes and with real things happening to them. And so I would say to somebody who is being approached to engage in something like this, is that now you're an accessory to the crime. Whatever happens at the end, whatever the result is, you were engaged in this. And sometimes, our actions can drive people to do one of a million things. And sometimes it's not only our actions, but the reaction, what that is going to end up on. And, you may not, God forbid, push somebody to do something, to hurt themselves, to hurt somebody else, to move or to take drastic steps. And then that's going to be on you, whether or not you're legally liable. Uh, at the end of the day, you have to know what your actions led somebody to. And I'll put that first. It's always, if this was happening to you or your friend, how would you feel?
Yeah.
Many times we don't really think when of what our actions really do to other people, because we're thinking of why we're acting in this way. Perhaps you feel entitled to X, Y, or Z, or you feel that your actions are they're reasonable based on what has happened or on what you think or what you believe. But it's always, I think, taking a step back and looking objectively. If somebody else was doing this, what would you think? But you could be, depending on what the actions lead to, what happens to the victim, they could be legally liable as well.
I would assume, Marcia, as well, if you're taking it upon yourself to circumvent your friend's protection order that she has against somebody, and you think, well, okay, she has a
Mhm.
protection order, she has a protection order against my friend, but she doesn't have a protection order against me, so I'll just take it upon myself to go and bully and intimidate that person. I would think that that's not a wise idea, but is that one way they try and circumvent these types of orders as well?
Definitely. And that's one of the reasons why more research in this area is necessary. In both instances that I mentioned where people use third parties, the people that were carrying out this thing did not have any repercussions. It was only that main stalker or that main person that was circumventing the order that really felt the consequences of the actions, because the other people were, for example, driving a car by X, Y, or Z place. It was not their individual actions on their own did not constitute stalking. It was the larger, when you put them together, everything, the course of conduct that the victim experienced. But then when you look at the eBay case, for example, they all worked together. There was no primary stalker. It was a group effort, you could say.
Mhm.
And so the difference is that some of the people did carry out the actions, and in that case, more than one was found guilty and will be serving prison time. And I don't know the names off the top of my head. That's why I'm staying away from mentioning them.
Of course.
But if you search for the eBay stalking case, they just got sentenced this year, recently. So it's very fresh in the news. But so, depending on the nature of their actions, I would say it's where the legal liability would be. Um, but there will be consequences, And so we need to be cognizant of that, regardless of who's the main stalker or who is doing these things. If you're engaging in them, you could be liable.
Thank you. Marcia, this is a question, kind of one of the last questions as we tie up here, because this is something that honestly I get asked about on a very regular basis, and I couldn't think of anybody better to explain this. And when I talk about this issue, I want to be clear, I don't mean any disrespect to anybody who might be talking about this as well, but there seems to be sort of there's a term out there you may have heard called gang stalking, and the people using that term seem to sort of fall into two different categories. Some of the people using that term are discussing the phenomenon which you and I are discussing right now, where a personality disordered individual is recruiting others to target them. But there is also, and it seems to be online, I've watched some videos of people discussing this phenomenon, and I don't understand what it is that they're seeing. But it seems to be a shared persecutory delusion. perhaps on the internet, and
Mm.
I'm watching videos of people who believe that little girls are driving by them in order to implant microchips sent from the government. The FBI agents are disguised as Muslim women who are walking by. And it seems to be, but there seems to be a lot of people who are believing this. And so are you familiar with this phenomenon, and how can we be clear if we're going to go to the police or be taken seriously as to, with all due respect to anyone out there, what this difference is, and how, because if I'm a police officer hearing that you're being gang stalked, that might be something that comes to mind.
No, of course. So
Thank you.
I'm not too familiar. I read exactly one paper on this issue when I was first starting my research, and that's when I realized that it was two very different things.
Right.
And again, and just like you said, I want to be very respectful, and I do not mean any offense to anybody who may be experiencing these issues or who may be working in this area. But I believe that gang stalking, at least to the extent that I have knowledge of it, it may be more of a shared delusion.
Okay.
Because and it could be one of those things where people feed it. They it's hard because so I had a personal relationship with somebody who experienced that exactly, and
Okay.
this is very separate from our work. Ultimately they were diagnosed with schizophrenia,
Right.
and and they sought treatment for that, and they're stable and everything is well.
Good.
But once upon a time they felt that they were being followed by the government,
Yes.
and so I can see how finding echo chambers online who may believe the same as, hey, that happened to me too, I believe it continues growing. And not to say that some people may not be targeted by X, Y, or Z organization for some reason, and
Sure.
that they could be followed, because the other part is, when we think of spies of the Cold War era, and the
Yeah.
KGB in the United States and all the
Yeah.
things that we were doing,
Yeah.
things when they declassify all those documents, certain things that have happened, you're like, wow, what if that had been happening to that person? They must have thought they were going crazy.
Oh,
And so
absolutely.
I'm sure that there are some isolated incidents, where that's some people really are experiencing horrific, harassment of that nature.
Mhm.
However, I think the MPS and multiple perpetrator stalking is more of a, these are things that are happening to people. These are verifiable facts and information versus, I believe that these things are happening. So if I was a victim of multiple perpetrator stalking coming to the police, you're coming with very specific evidence.
Okay.
Stalking on its own, for example, even to get a protection order or a no contact order, you need proof of
Mhm.
this person's course of conduct that has been targeting you and how this has caused emotional distress or fear.
Mhm.
Unless a person can prove that, they cannot prove stalking, unfortunately.
Mhm.
And it's hard. So when you have this more, I would say, abstract um incidents where there's really no verifiable information, or there's no photographs of proof, and that's where it weighs. I would say that physical consent is where you can kind of draw the line between the two.
Thank you. Thank you. That is just the perfect explanation. I had no idea how to explain that to anybody. Thank you. That was amazing. That answers so many questions, Marcia. Um, for this topic in general, to kind of tie off here, can I ask where you're going with it in the future? What is opening up for the research, and where can people in whatever fields that they're in who want to learn more about this, where can they go?
Sorry, you cut out a little bit there at the end. So when it
Okay.
comes to the research on its, I'll wait for you to, there we go. Um, the research itself, my main area right now I want to explore is specifically the people that say they have multiple stalkers working together. As I mentioned, about 30% of stalking victims say they have more than one stalker. However, that's a few different groups. So I want to isolate those that say they do have more than one stalker working together and explore those cases a little bit more in depth. Who is the stalker? Is it a relative? Is it an intimate partner? Is it a stranger? And the motivations behind them, and why, maybe how they engage others. But my difficulty in that sense is that my data comes from the National Crime Victimization Survey, stalking supplement. And so it's just yes or no questions. Has this happened to you? Yes, no. So there's no real context. So my hopes in an ideal world is that I will have I'll be able to conduct interviews, more in-depth interviews that can give some context and allow us to really ask, how does that look like? You said you had 3 people stalking you. Can you elaborate? So that we can really contextualize what those cases look like beyond just the yeses or nos. Now, when it comes to my work, the best way, honestly, right now to link it would be through my LinkedIn profile, which I can share with you. But if you search for Marcia Diaz in the Miami area, it'll be me. But I link all my research through there. I will hopefully be publishing my dissertation research within the next year or so. And that's hopefully be 2 different studies talking about the consequences of multiple perpetrator stalking and the different risk factors, what increases the chances of being targeted by more than one person. And hopefully, my work will inspire others to continue this line of research and we can learn more about the realities of these instances.
I hope so too. I think it's incredible that you are touching on this topic. I am so grateful. I can't wait to see more come out of it and what happens. I'm really excited. And Marcia, thank you so much. I'm like I mentioned, I'm going to give you a goodbye after recording here, but thank you so much for taking the time today, especially on a weekend when you're so busy to chat with me about this, to share your research. I just have goosebumps right now. It was such a great chat. Thank you for taking the time to do this today.
Oh, no, thank you so much for having me. It's such an obscure topic that even having the platform to be able to share a little bit more about my work and speak to somebody who's really interested in the area, it's a gift to me. So thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so cool. And believe me, it's going to be, there's a lot of people who are excited to have an expert talk about it. So thank you. Thank you so much again, Marcia.